The iron bars pressed cold against Temperance's massive shoulders as another stone struck her cheek, drawing blood that mixed with tears she refused to let fall. 7 feet tall and built like a mountain, she made the cramped circus cage look like a child's toy box. The crowd outside jeered and pointed, their faces twisted with disgust and fear as they stared at the woman they called a monster. Before we continue, drop a comment below with your country and what time it is right now where you're watching. Whether it's sunrise in Nairobi, midnight in New York, afternoon in Canada, or evening in France. I want to know. Don't just sit back. Tell me where in the world you are. Now let's dive into the story. Step right up and see the killer widow. The ringmaster's voice boomed across the dusty town square of Cedar Ridge. His greasy mustache twitched as he counted the coins flowing into his grimy hands. Watch her massive fists that crushed her own husband's skull like a watermelon. Temperance closed her eyes and tried to block out the lies. She hadn't crushed anyone. Samuel had been drunk again that night, swinging his fists at her face like he always did when the whiskey took hold. But this time, when she pushed him away, he stumbled backward and cracked his head on the stone fireplace. The sound still haunted her dreams 3 years later. A little girl pressed her face between the crowd's legs, staring up at Temperance with wide blue eyes. Unlike the others, she wasn't afraid. She was curious. Temperance's heart ached as she remembered her own daughter, barely 6 years old, when the fever took her 2 winters before Samuel died. Little Mercy had looked at her mother the same way, with pure love instead of fear. "Mama, why is the lady so sad?" the little girl whispered to her mother. The woman jerked her daughter away like Temperance was a rabid animal. "Don't look at that thing, Susie. It's not natural." The word thing hit harder than any stone. Temperance had been called every cruel name imaginable over the past 3 years. Monster, beast, killer, freak. But somehow, being called a thing made her feel like her humanity had been stripped away completely. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the metal cage, turning it into an oven that cooked her slowly. Her plain gray dress, the only one the circus owned that came close to fitting her enormous frame, stuck to her skin with sweat and grime. The chains around her wrists had worn raw spots that never healed, and the smell of her own unwashed body mixed with the stench of rotting vegetables the crowd had thrown. In the distance, she spotted a lone figure leaning against a weathered fence post. A cowboy with a worn hat pulled low over his eyes, but unlike everyone else, he wasn't laughing or pointing. He was just watching. Something in his stillness made her stomach flutter with an emotion she'd forgotten existed. Hope. But hope was dangerous for someone like her. Hope was what got you hurt. Hope was what made you believe that maybe, just maybe, someone might see past the size and the scars and the reputation to find the broken woman underneath. The cowboy pushed off from the fence and started walking toward her cage. Temperance's massive hands gripped the bars so tightly her knuckles went white. Whatever he wanted, it couldn't be good. In her experience, men who approached her cage after dark always had the worst intentions. She had no idea her entire world was about to change forever. The cowboy's boots made soft thuds in the dirt as he walked closer, each step measured and deliberate. Temperance watched him through the bars, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Most men who approached her cage moved with either cruel excitement or nervous bravado. This one moved like he was walking to church. He stopped just outside arm's reach, close enough that she could see the deep lines around his eyes and the silver threading through his dark hair. His clothes were clean but worn, the kind of honest where that came from hard work rather than poverty. A working man's hands, she noticed, scarred and calloused but gentle as they rested at his sides. "Evening, ma'am," he said, tipping his hat with the same respect he might show a lady stepping out of a fancy carriage. Temperance blinked in surprise. No one had called her ma'am in 3 years. She'd been called every vile name imaginable, but never something that suggested she was still human, still worthy of basic courtesy. "You hungry?" he asked, reaching into his coat pocket. Her stomach clenched at the word. The ringmaster fed her scraps twice a day, barely enough to keep her alive, but not enough to give her strength to fight back. She nodded slightly, not trusting her voice. He pulled out a cloth bundle and unwrapped it carefully, revealing thick slices of bread, cheese, and dried beef. Real food. Good food. The kind of meal she used to make for her family back when she had a family. "My name's Jake Sullivan," he said, breaking off a piece of bread and sliding it through the bars. His fingers brushed hers as she took it, and she flinched from the unexpected kindness of human touch that didn't hurt. "What's your name?" "Your real name, not whatever that snake oil salesman calls you." "Temperance," she whispered, the word feeling strange on her lips. She'd almost forgotten she had a real name. "That's a beautiful name," Jake said, and the way he said it made her believe he meant it. Temperance. Like the virtue. She wanted to laugh bitterly at that. What virtue was left in a woman who'd killed her husband, even accidentally? What virtue existed in someone who let herself be displayed like a circus animal? But something in his eyes stopped her from saying those things. Jake continued passing food through the bars, watching as she ate with the desperation of someone who never knew when the next meal might come. He didn't stare at her size or make comments about how much she could probably eat. He just fed her like she was a person who deserved to be fed. "You don't belong in there," he said quietly, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. The crowd had mostly dispersed as the sun set, leaving only a few drunken men stumbling between the carnival tents. "Yes, I do," Temperance replied, her voice hollow. "I'm a killer. I'm dangerous." Jake studied her face in the flickering light of the nearby torches. "You got the gentlest hands I ever seen on someone," he said. "Way you took that bread, way you're holding it. That's not how dangerous people move." Temperance looked down at her enormous hands, seeing them through his eyes for the first time in years. She'd always thought they looked like weapons, these massive fists that could crush a man's skull without meaning to. But Jake saw something different. "I killed my husband," she said, testing him, waiting for him to recoil in horror like everyone else did. "Did you mean to?" The simple question hit her like a physical blow. No one had ever asked her that before. The sheriff, the judge, the jury, the crowds. They all assumed that someone her size, someone with her strength, must have killed on purpose. "No," she whispered, tears finally breaking free. "Never. He drank too much. He got mean when he drank. That night, he came at me with his fists flying like always, but I was so tired of it. So tired of the bruises and the fear. I pushed him away, just to make it stop, and he fell, and you've been punishing yourself ever since." Jake finished gently. She nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. Jake was quiet for a long moment, studying her face in the torchlight. Then he did something that shocked her to her core. He reached through the bars and gently wiped a tear from her cheek with his thumb. "My wife died 2 years back," he said softly. "Fever took her, same as it took a lot of folks that winter. Point is, I know what it's like to lose someone and blame yourself for it." The tenderness in his voice, the understanding in his eyes, broke something loose inside Temperance's chest. For the first time in 3 years, she didn't feel completely alone in the world. Jake didn't leave when the carnival lights dimmed and the last of the gawkers stumbled home. He settled himself on an overturned crate beside her cage, close enough that they could talk without the whole town hearing their conversation. Temperance had never experienced anything like it. A man choosing to spend time with her simply because he wanted to. "Tell me about before," Jake said, his voice soft in the darkness. "Before all this madness started. What was your life like?" Temperance hesitated. She'd buried those memories so deep she wasn't sure she could dig them up without bleeding. But something about Jake's patient silence made her want to try. "I had a little girl," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "Mercy." She had the biggest brown eyes and the sweetest laugh. Used to follow me around the house like a little shadow, always wanting to help with the cooking and the cleaning. A smile tugged at the corner of her mouth, the first real smile in 3 years. She wasn't afraid of my size like other children were. Said I gave the best hugs in the whole world because I was big enough to wrap around her twice. Jake listened without interrupting, letting her words flow like water from a broken dam. "I was a good mother," Temperance continued, her voice growing stronger. "I read to her every night, taught her letters and numbers, made her little dresses with wildflowers embroidered on the sleeves. She loved wildflowers, especially the yellow ones. What happened to her? Jake asked gently. The smile faded from Temperance's face like a candle being snuffed out. Fever. Same winter that took your wife. She was only 6 years old, Jake. 6. And I couldn't save her. All my size, all my strength, and I couldn't fight off something I couldn't even see. Tears rolled down her cheeks, and this time she didn't try to stop them. Samuel blamed me. Said if I'd been a normal-sized woman, maybe God wouldn't have cursed our family. Said Mercy died because her mother was a freak of nature. Jake's jaw tightened in the darkness. He was wrong. Was he? Temperance's voice broke. Look at me, Jake. I'm not natural. Women aren't supposed to be this big, this strong. Maybe Samuel was right. Maybe I am cursed. Jake stood up from his crate and moved closer to the bars. In the moonlight, she could see the fierce determination in his eyes. Listen to me, Temperance. There is nothing cursed about you. Nothing wrong with you. You're just different, and different scares people who are too small-minded to see past their own fears. The preacher in my hometown said I was an abomination, she whispered. Said God made me this way as punishment for some terrible sin. Then that preacher was a fool, Jake said firmly. God doesn't make mistakes, Temperance. He made you exactly as you are for a reason, even if we can't see what that reason is yet. Something in his voice made her look up at him. Really look at him. Jake wasn't a big man, probably average height and build, but there was something solid about him. Something unshakable. Why are you being kind to me? She asked. What do you want? It was a question born from 3 years of cruelty, 3 years of learning that kindness always came with a price. Men who visited her cage late at night usually wanted things that made her skin crawl. Jake was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his words were measured and careful. I had a sister, he said. Lydia. She was born with a twisted spine that made her walk funny. Kids used to throw rocks at her on the way to school, call her names. Adults would cross the street rather than look at her. She died when she was 16, never knowing what it felt like to be loved for who she was instead of pitted for what she looked like. He paused, his hands gripping the fence rails. I swore after Lydia died that if I ever met someone who was hurting the way she hurt, I'd try to show them kindness. Real kindness, with no strings attached. Temperance stared at him in wonder. In 3 years of captivity, no one had ever explained their kindness to her. Mostly because no one had ever shown her real kindness. I've been watching you for 3 days, Jake continued. Saw how gentle you were with that sparrow that built its nest in the corner of your cage. Saw how you saved half your water for it during the heat wave. Saw how you sang lullabies to yourself at night when you thought no one was listening. Temperance's breath caught. She hadn't realized anyone could hear her singing. A woman who sings lullabies to herself isn't a killer, Jake said softly. She's just someone who's forgotten how to hope. The words hung in the air between them like a bridge neither of them was quite ready to cross. But for the first time in 3 years, Temperance felt something stirring in her chest that felt dangerously close to hope. The sun was barely peeking over the horizon when Temperance heard the jingle of coins and harsh voices approaching her cage. She'd spent the night thinking about Jake's words, replaying their conversation like a song she couldn't get out of her head. For the first time in years, she dreamed of something other than Samuel's blood pooling on the cabin floor. Wake up, you oversized cow. Silas Grimm, the ringmaster, banged his walking stick against the bars. His bloodshot eyes and whiskey breath told the story of another night spent drinking away his profits. Got us a visitor with deep pockets. Temperance sat up slowly, her massive frame unfolding like a mountain coming to life. The chains around her wrists clinked as she moved, a sound that had become as familiar as her own heartbeat. But something felt different this morning. The despair that usually weighed her down like lead felt lighter somehow. Then she saw Jake standing behind Grimm, and her heart stopped. He looked different in the morning light. Cleaner, more determined. His hair was freshly combed, his clothes pressed. He carried a leather satchel that bulged with what could only be money. Lots of money. This the one you want? Grimm asked, gesturing at Temperance like she was livestock at auction. I gotta warn you, mister, she's dangerous. Killed her own husband with her bare hands. Takes 3 men just to feed her without getting close enough for her to grab. Jake ignored Grim completely, his eyes focused entirely on Temperance. "Good morning," he said, tipping his hat just like he had the night before. Temperance's throat went dry. Whatever was happening here, it was bigger than their midnight conversation. The way Jake stood, the way he held himself, the formal politeness in his voice. This wasn't a social visit. "I want to buy her," Jake said simply. The words hit Temperance like a physical blow. Buy her? Like she really was livestock. Like she was property to be traded from one owner to another. The hope that had been building in her chest crumbled like a house of cards. Grim's eyes lit up with greedy delight. "Well now, that's interesting. She ain't cheap, you understand. She's my star attraction. Brings in more money than the rest of the show combined." "How much?" Jake asked, his voice steady. Grim stroked his greasy mustache, calculating. $500. It was an enormous sum, enough to buy a small ranch or a year's worth of supplies. Temperance expected Jake to laugh, to walk away, to reveal that this was all some cruel joke. Instead, he opened his satchel and began counting out gold coins. "That's robbery, and you know it," Jake said calmly as he stacked the coins. "But I'll pay it." Temperance watched in stunned silence as Jake handed over what must have been his life savings. Why would anyone pay that much for her? What could he possibly want that was worth such a fortune? The answer that came to her mind made her stomach turn. She'd heard stories about rich men who bought carnival freaks for their private collections, keeping them as exotic pets or worse. Her size and strength might be valuable to someone with dark tastes and unlimited money. "Pleasure doing business with you," Grim said, snatching up the coins with both hands. He pulled a rusty key from his vest pocket and tossed it to Jake. "She's all yours now. Fair warning, though, don't turn your back on her. She's killed once, she'll kill again." Jake caught the key and walked slowly toward the cage door. Temperance pressed herself against the far wall, suddenly terrified. The devil she knew was walking away with Jake's money, and the devil she didn't know was unlocking her prison. "Temperance," Jake said softly as he turned the key in the lock. "I need you to trust me." "Trust you?" Her voice came out as a harsh whisper. "You just bought me like I was a horse at market. What do you want with me? What are you going to do?" The cage door swung open with a creak that sounded like freedom and terror all at once. Jake stepped back, giving her space, showing no fear despite what everyone said about her being dangerous. "I'm going to set you free," he said. "But first, I need to ask you something, and I need you to really think about your answer." Temperance remained pressed against the back wall of the cage, afraid to move, afraid to hope, afraid to believe that this moment was real. Jake took off his hat and held it respectfully in his hands, like he was standing in church. When he spoke again, his voice carried across the empty carnival grounds like a prayer. "Temperance, I know this is going to sound crazy, and I know you have every reason not to trust me. But I've been alone for 2 years now, and you've been alone for 3. We're both carrying pain that's too heavy for one person to bear." He paused, taking a deep breath that seemed to come from the bottom of his soul. "What I want to ask you is this. Will you marry me?" The world went silent. Even the morning birds seemed to stop singing as Jake's words hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot. Temperance stared at him, certain she'd misheard, certain that 3 years of captivity had finally driven her completely mad. "What did you say?" she whispered, her massive hands gripping the cage bars so tightly they bent slightly under the pressure. Jake knelt down in the dirt, right there in front of her open cage door, his hat still clutched respectfully in his hands. His eyes never left her face, and in them she saw something that terrified her more than any threat or insult ever could. She saw sincerity. "I said, will you marry me?" "Temperance," he repeated, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was asking. "I'm asking you to be my wife." A laugh bubbled up from somewhere deep in her chest, a sound caught between hysteria and disbelief. "You're insane. You just paid $500 for a freak show attraction, and now you want to marry it." "I paid $500 to free a woman who deserves better than living in a cage," Jake corrected gently. "And I'm asking that woman, not an attraction, to marry me." Temperance shook her head violently, her unkempt hair flying around her face. "Look at me, Jake. Really look at me. I'm 7 feet tall and built like a bear. I killed my husband. I smell like a barnyard animal. What could you possibly want with someone like me? Jake rose to his feet, but remained at a respectful distance, sensing her need for space. I want a partner. Someone who understands what it's like to carry guilt that doesn't belong to them. Someone who knows how it feels to be alone in a crowd of people. This is insane, Temperance repeated, but her voice lacked conviction. People like me don't get proposals. People like me don't get happy endings. Says who? Jake challenged. Says Grim? Says the people who paid money to stare at you like you were an animal? Says the preacher who called you an abomination? Why are you letting their voices be louder than your own heart? His words hit her like physical blows. For 3 years, she'd accepted other people's definitions of what she was, what she deserved, what she could hope for. She'd let their hatred become her truth. I don't understand, she said, her voice breaking. Why me? You could have any woman in this town. Any normal woman who could give you normal children and a normal life. Why would you choose someone like me? Jake was quiet for a moment, his weathered face thoughtful in the growing morning light. Behind them, the carnival was beginning to stir as other performers emerged from their tents, but he seemed oblivious to everything except her. My first wife, Anna, she was everything this town would call perfect, he said finally. Small and delicate and pretty as a flower. But she was also cold and critical and never satisfied with anything I did. She married me for my land and my prospects, not for who I was. He paused, his eyes distant with memory. When she died, I thought I'd never want to marry again. Thought I was done with trying to make someone happy who could never be made happy. But then I saw you. You saw a circus freak, Temperance said bitterly. I saw a woman who sang lullabies to herself when she thought no one was listening, Jake replied. I saw someone who shared her water with a sparrow in the heat of summer. I saw strength that could crush a man's bones being used to cradle something fragile and small. I saw kindness surviving in a place where it had every reason to die. Temperance felt tears running down her cheeks again. But these were different from the tears of despair she'd cried for 3 years. These felt clean somehow, like rain washing dust from a window. I can't have children, she said, testing him with her deepest shame. The doctor said after Mercy was born that my body wasn't made for it. Said it was a miracle she survived it all. Then we'll fill our house with other things, Jake said without hesitation. Animals that need caring for. Land that needs tending. Maybe children who've lost their parents and need someone to love them. His acceptance of her brokenness was more shocking than his proposal. Samuel had raged about her barrenness, blamed her for not giving him sons, used it as another reason to drink and hit and curse. I'm dangerous, she tried again, desperate to make him understand what he was asking for. When I get scared or angry, I don't know my own strength. I could hurt you without meaning to. So could a horse, Jake said with a slight smile. But I've been working with horses all my life. I've learned to read their moods, respect their power, earn their trust. I reckon I could learn to do the same with a person if she'd let me. The comparison should have insulted her, but somehow it didn't. There was respect in it, an acknowledgement of her strength rather than fear of it. This is the craziest thing anyone has ever asked me, Temperance said, wiping her eyes with the back of her massive hand. I know, Jake agreed. But crazy doesn't always mean wrong. Sometimes crazy just means brave enough to try something that's never been done before. He extended his hand toward her, palm up, an invitation rather than a demand. What do you say, Temperance? Will you take a chance on crazy? Temperance stared at Jake's outstretched hand for what felt like a lifetime. His palm was weathered and scarred from years of ranch work, but it was steady as a rock. No trembling, no hesitation, no fear. Just an open invitation to step out of her cage and into a life she'd never dared to imagine. Behind her, the metal bars that had been her prison for 3 years seemed to whisper all the reasons she should stay. She was safe here, predictable here, contained here. No one expected anything from a caged animal except to be stared at and feared. But out there, beyond the cage door, lay the terrifying possibility of hope. I don't know how to be a wife, she whispered, her voice so soft Jake had to lean closer to hear her. I don't know how to be anything except this. She gestured at her enormous frame, her dirty clothes, her matted hair. Neither do I, Jake admitted with surprising honesty. I don't know how to be a husband to someone like you, but I figure we can learn together, if you're willing. Slowly, as if she were moving through deep water, Temperance reached out and placed her massive hand in his. Jake's fingers couldn't wrap all the way around her palm, but his grip was firm and warm and absolutely fearless. Yes, she breathed, the words so quiet it was barely more than a whisper. Then, louder, stronger, like she was claiming something that belonged to her. Yes, Jake Sullivan. I'll marry you. The smile that spread across Jake's face was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. He helped her step out of the cage, and for the first time in 3 years, Temperance felt solid ground beneath her feet without iron bars around her. But their moment of quiet joy was shattered by the sound of running footsteps and angry voices. Word of the proposal had spread through the carnival faster than wildfire, and now half the town was rushing toward them with faces twisted in shock and outrage. "Have you lost your mind, Sullivan?" shouted Mayor Whitman, his round face red with indignation. "You can't marry that thing. It's not natural. It's not Christian. She killed her husband," called out Mrs. Henderson, the banker's wife, pointing at Temperance like she was a poisonous snake. "What's to stop her from killing you too?" More voices joined the chorus of condemnation. "Freak, monster, abomination." The words hit Temperance like physical blows, each one designed to send her crawling back into her cage where freaks belonged. Jake stepped protectively in front of her, his body language shifting from gentle suitor to fierce defender in the span of a heartbeat. "That's enough," he said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man who'd faced down charging bulls and winter storms. "You're talking about my future wife, and I won't stand for disrespect." "Your wife." Dr. Mitchell pushed through the crowd, his medical bag clutched in his white-knuckled hands. "Jake, that woman is 7 feet tall and weighs more than your prize bull. The physical complications of such a union could kill you." Temperance felt her cheeks burn with shame. Even now, even after saying yes, they were talking about her like she wasn't standing right there. Like she was a problem to be solved rather than a person to be respected. "I appreciate your concern, Doc," Jake said evenly. "But my personal life is my own business. Not when it affects the whole town." Mayor Whitman sputtered. "What are people going to think? What are they going to say about Cedar Ridge when word gets out that we let a normal man marry a what?" Jake's voice dropped to a dangerous growl. "Go ahead and finish that sentence, Mayor. Tell me what you think my future wife is." The mayor's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air, but no words came out. Even in his rage, he wasn't brave enough to insult Temperance directly to the face of the man who'd just claimed her as his bride. Sheriff Daniels pushed forward, his hand resting meaningfully on his gun belt. "Now see here, Sullivan. I've got a responsibility to keep the peace in this town. That woman is a known killer. I can't just let her walk around free. She was never charged with a crime," Jake pointed out. "Self-defense isn't murder, even when the person defending themselves is bigger than average." "Says who?" the sheriff challenged. "Says the law," Jake replied firmly. "And says anyone with enough sense to see the difference between an accident and intentional harm." Temperance watched this exchange with growing amazement. Jake wasn't just defending her, he was fighting for her, standing up to the entire town, risking his reputation and his standing in the community, all for a woman he'd known for less than a day. "This is madness," whispered Mrs. Henderson to her husband. "Someone needs to stop this before it goes too far." But Jake had already taken Temperance's massive hand in his and was walking toward the church at the end of the street, his chin held high and his shoulders set with determination. "Come on," he said to her quietly. "Let's go find a preacher brave enough to marry us before this crowd decides to do something stupid." As they walked away from the jeering crowd, Temperance felt something she hadn't experienced in 3 years. She felt protected, not because she was helpless, but because someone finally cared enough to stand between her and the cruelty of the world. For the first time since Samuel died, she wasn't walking alone. The church door slammed shut behind them with a sound like thunder, cutting off the angry voices of the crowd outside. Inside, the small wooden sanctuary felt peaceful and sacred, sunlight streaming through stained glass windows and painting rainbow patterns on the worn wooden pews. Temperance had forgotten how beautiful churches could be when you weren't being dragged to them in chains. Reverend Thomas looked up from his morning prayers, his kind eyes widening in surprise when he saw Jake enter with the town's most feared resident. The elderly preacher was one of the few people in Cedar Ridge who'd never paid money to gawk at the circus, and now Temperance understood why. There was genuine compassion in his weathered face. "Jake," the Reverend said carefully, rising from his knees beside the altar. "I heard some commotion outside. Is everything all right?" "Better than all right, Reverend," Jake replied, his hand still firmly clasped around Temperance's. "I'd like you to marry us." The old preacher's eyebrows shot up toward his thinning hairline. "Marry you? Too?" His voice trailed off as he looked at Temperance, clearly struggling with how to address her. "To Miss Temperance," Jake supplied firmly. "The woman I love." Love. The word hit Temperance like a lightning bolt. Jake had said many beautiful things to her, but this was the first time he'd used that particular word. She looked down at him in wonder, searching his face for any sign that he was just saying it to convince the preacher. But his eyes held the same steady sincerity they'd shown since the moment they met. "I see," Reverend Thomas said slowly. "And Miss Temperance, is this what you want as well?" It was the first time in 3 years that anyone had asked Temperance what she wanted. Not what she deserved, not what was appropriate for someone like her, but what she actually wanted for herself. "Yes," she said, her voice stronger than she'd expected. "Yes, it is." The Reverend nodded thoughtfully, but before he could respond, the church doors burst open again. Mayor Whitman stormed in, followed by half the town council and a dozen other angry citizens. Their boots thundered on the wooden floor as they surrounded the altar like an army preparing for battle. "Reverend Thomas," the mayor panted, his face purple with exertion and outrage. "You cannot perform this ceremony. It's unnatural, ungodly, and dangerous to the moral fabric of our community." "Is it now?" the Reverend asked mildly, his calm voice a stark contrast to the mayor's hysteria. "And which part of Christian teaching exactly forbids the marriage of two consenting adults?" "Look at her," Mrs. Henderson shrieked, pointing at Temperance like she was something that had crawled out of a swamp. "She's not natural. God doesn't make women that size. God makes all kinds of people, Mrs. Henderson," the Reverend replied gently. "Tall ones and short ones, big ones and small ones. I don't recall reading anywhere in Scripture that His love has size restrictions." Temperance felt tears pricking her eyes. After 3 years of being called an abomination by people who claimed to speak for God, hearing a real man of faith defend her existence felt like a miracle. "She's a killer," someone shouted from the back of the crowd. "She defended herself against an abusive husband," Reverend Thomas corrected firmly. "There's a difference between murder and survival, and any man who's ever read the story of David and Goliath should understand that sometimes the smaller person doesn't win." Jake squeezed Temperance's hand, and she realized he was shaking slightly, not with fear, but with barely contained anger at the way these people were talking about the woman he'd chosen to marry. "Reverend," Jake said, his voice tight with control, "I respect these people's right to their opinions, but I won't stand here and let them insult my bride on what should be the happiest day of our lives. Will you marry us or not?" The old preacher looked around at the angry faces surrounding them, then back at Jake and Temperance. A slow smile spread across his weathered features. "Son," he said, "I've been performing weddings in this town for 37 years, and I've seen all kinds of couples come through those doors. Rich and poor, young and old, beautiful and plain. But I've never seen two people look at each other the way you two do." He moved to stand behind the altar, opening his worn Bible with hands that shook slightly from age but held steady with purpose. "If anyone here has a legal objection to this union," he announced in a voice that carried to every corner of the church, "speak now or forever hold your peace." The crowd erupted in shouts and protests, but Reverend Thomas held up his hand for silence. "I said legal objections," he repeated firmly. "Personal opinions and moral judgments don't count in the eyes of God or the law." When no one could produce an actual legal reason to stop the wedding, the Reverend smiled, and began the ceremony. Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today to witness the union of Jake Sullivan and Temperance in holy matrimony. His voice rose above the angry murmurs of the crowd, strong and clear and absolutely unshakable. As he spoke the ancient words of love and commitment, Temperance felt something she'd lost 3 years ago settling back into her chest. She felt like she belonged somewhere again. When the Reverend asked if she would take Jake as her husband, her "I do" rang out like a bell, clear and strong and full of hope. And when Jake promised to love, honor, and cherish her for as long as they both lived, Temperance finally understood what it meant to be seen as worthy of promises. The kiss that sealed their marriage was gentle and brief, Jake standing on his toes to reach Temperance's lips while she bent down to meet him halfway. It wasn't the passionate embrace of fairy tales, but it was real and honest and filled with promise. When they broke apart, Temperance saw tears in Jake's eyes that matched her own. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," Reverend Thomas declared with satisfaction, closing his Bible with a decisive snap. "What God has joined together, let no man put asunder." The crowd behind them grumbled and muttered, but they were married now. Legally, officially, permanently married. Temperance Sullivan, she thought to herself, testing the name in her mind. After 3 years of being called nothing but freak and monster, she had a real name again. Jake took her arm like a proper gentleman escorting his bride, and together they walked down the aisle between the hostile faces of Cedar Ridge's citizens. Some glared, some shook their heads in disgust, but a few looked almost curious, as if they were witnessing something they'd never seen before and weren't quite sure how to react. Outside the church, Jake's wagon waited in the dusty street. It was a simple farm wagon, built for work rather than comfort, but to Temperance it looked like the finest carriage in the world. Jake helped her climb up onto the seat, which creaked ominously under her weight but held firm. "Where are we going?" she asked as Jake took the reins. "Home," he said simply, and the words sent a thrill through her that was better than any wedding ring. The ride to Jake's ranch took them through rolling hills covered in tall grass that swayed like ocean waves in the afternoon breeze. Temperance had forgotten how beautiful the world could be when you weren't seeing it through iron bars. The sky seemed bigger than she remembered, bluer and more endless than anything she dreamed of during her years in captivity. "Tell me about your ranch," she said, needing to fill the comfortable silence with something other than her own racing thoughts. "It's not much," Jake replied modestly. "About 200 acres of good grazing land, a small house, a barn that's seen better days. I run cattle mostly, some horses. It's quiet, peaceful, perfect for people who want to be left alone to live their lives." People who want to be left alone. Temperance understood exactly what he meant. After the spectacle of their wedding, being left alone sounded like paradise. "I should warn you," Jake continued, his voice careful. "The house isn't built for someone your size. Doorways might be tight, furniture might not fit. I can make adjustments, build new things if you need them." The thoughtfulness of his concern touched her deeply. He wasn't expecting her to squeeze herself into a life that didn't fit. He was planning to reshape his world to accommodate hers. "I'm used to making do," she said quietly. 3 years in a circus cage teaches you how to fit into small spaces." Jake's jaw tightened. "You'll never have to make do again," he said firmly. "You're not a guest in my life, Temperance. You're my wife. This is your home now, and we'll make it work for both of us." When they crested the final hill, Temperance got her first look at the Sullivan Ranch. It was exactly as Jake had described it, modest, well-maintained, and absolutely perfect. The house was small and white with a wraparound porch, surrounded by flower gardens that someone had tended with obvious love. The barn was weathered but sturdy, and beyond it stretched green pastures dotted with cattle and horses. "It's beautiful," she breathed, and meant it completely. Jake pulled the wagon up to the front porch and set the brake. For a moment, they both sat in silence, looking at the house that would be their home together. Then Jake climbed down and walked around to help Temperance from the wagon. But instead of just offering her his hand, he did something that stopped her heart. He swept her up into his arms, carrying her like any groom might carry his bride across the threshold. She outweighed him by at least 100 pounds, but somehow he managed it, his face red with effort, but his smile genuine and proud. "Welcome home, Mrs. Sullivan," he said as he set her down gently on the porch. Mrs. Sullivan. The name wrapped around her like a warm quilt, filling spaces in her heart that had been empty for so long she'd forgotten they existed. The inside of the house was clean and comfortable, furnished with simple but well-made furniture. Everything was smaller than Temperance was used to, but somehow that made it feel cozy rather than cramped. This was a real home, lived in and loved, not a showcase or a prison. "I know it's not much," Jake said, suddenly seeming nervous as he watched her take in her new surroundings. "It's perfect," Temperance said, running her massive hand along the smooth wooden table where Jake obviously ate his meals alone. "It's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." And she meant it. After 3 years of sleeping on straw in a metal cage, eating scraps from dirty bowls, and having no privacy or dignity, this simple farmhouse felt like a palace. "Are you hungry?" Jake asked. "I'm not much of a cook, but I can manage bacon and eggs." The offer of a home-cooked meal, prepared with care rather than thrown at her like slop for animals, brought fresh tears to her eyes. "I'd like that very much," she said. As Jake bustled around the kitchen, Temperance sat carefully on one of his chairs and watched him work. He moved with quiet efficiency, humming softly to himself as he prepared their first meal as husband and wife. This was what normal people did, she realized. They made dinner together and talked about their day and planned for tomorrow. For the first time in 3 years, Temperance felt like a normal person. 3 weeks into their marriage, Temperance woke to the sound of breaking glass and angry voices outside their bedroom window. Jake was already sitting up in bed, his hand reaching for the rifle he kept leaning against the wall. In the moonlight, she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw was set for trouble. "Stay inside," he whispered, pulling on his boots. "Whatever happens, don't come out until I tell you it's safe." But Temperance was already reaching for the dress she'd laid across the chair. "If there's trouble, I'm not hiding while you face it alone." "Temperance, please." Jake's voice carried a desperation she'd never heard before. "These people, they've been getting angrier every day since our wedding. I don't know what they might do." The voices outside grew louder, more aggressive. Through the window, Temperance could see torches flickering in the darkness, shadows moving across their front yard like an army preparing for war. She counted at least a dozen men, maybe more. "Sullivan." Mayor Whitman's voice boomed across the night. "Come out here. We need to talk." Jake checked his rifle and moved toward the front door, but Temperance caught his arm. Her massive hand dwarfed his, and for a moment he seemed surprised by her strength. "What do they want?" she asked, though part of her already knew the answer. "They want you gone," Jake said quietly. "They've been organizing, holding meetings. Some of the women are saying they're afraid to let their children play outside with you living so close to town." The words hit Temperance like physical blows. Even married, even living quietly on Jake's ranch, even trying to be invisible, she was still the monster in their nightmares. "Maybe I should go," she whispered. "Maybe they're right. Maybe I don't belong here." Jake spun to face her, his eyes blazing with an intensity that took her breath away. "Don't you dare. Don't you dare let them make you feel like you don't belong in your own home." Another crash of breaking glass, this time closer. They were destroying Jake's property, taking out their hatred on anything connected to her. "Sullivan, we know you can hear us." Sheriff Daniels had joined the mob, his voice carrying the authority of the law. "That woman needs to go back where she came from. She's a danger to this community." Jake moved toward the door again, but this time Temperance stepped in front of him. At 7 feet tall, she blocked his path completely, her massive frame filling the doorway. "No," she said firmly. "If they want to talk to someone about me, they can talk to me." "Temperance, no? These aren't reasonable people right now. They're a mob, and mobs do things that individuals would never do." "I'm tired of hiding," she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I'm tired of being afraid. I'm tired of letting other people decide what I am and where I belong." Before Jake could stop her, Temperance opened the front door and stepped onto the porch. The sight of her emerging from the house sent a ripple of movement through the crowd, some men stepping back instinctively, while others raised their torches higher. "You want to talk about me?" she called out, her voice carrying across the yard like thunder. "Here I am. Talk." Mayor Whitman stepped forward, flanked by Sheriff Daniels and Dr. Mitchell. Behind them, she could see faces she recognized from town, people who'd bought bread from the same baker and attended the same church, but now looked at her like she was something that had crawled out of hell. "You need to leave," the mayor said without preamble. "Pack your things and go back to whatever circus will take you. This town isn't big enough for someone like you." "Someone like me?" Temperance stepped to the edge of the porch, her height giving her the advantage of looking down at them. "What exactly am I like, Mayor? What crime have I committed since coming here?" "You killed your husband," someone shouted from the back of the crowd. "I defended myself against a drunk who was trying to beat me to death," Temperance corrected, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. "And that happened 100 miles from here, 3 years ago. What have I done in Cedar Ridge?" The crowd fell silent, unable to answer because the truth was she'd done nothing except marry a man who loved her. "I'll tell you what she's done," came a new voice from the darkness. Mrs. Henderson pushed through the crowd, her face twisted with hatred. "She's corrupted one of our finest men. She's made a mockery of the sacred institution of marriage. She's turned our town into a laughingstock. And you're afraid," Temperance said quietly, but her words carried clearly in the night air. "You're afraid because if Jake can love someone like me, it means your children might grow up thinking differently than you do. It means your safe little world where everyone looks the same and thinks the same might have to change." A murmur went through the crowd, some nodding in agreement with Mrs. Henderson while others looked uncomfortable, as if Temperance's words had hit closer to home than they wanted to admit. "We're not afraid," Sheriff Daniels declared, but his voice lacked conviction. "We're protecting our community." "From what?" Jake's voice cut through the night as he stepped onto the porch beside his wife. "From a woman who's never hurt anyone except in self-defense? From someone who tends my garden and feeds stray cats and reads books by the fire at night? She's not natural," Dr. Mitchell called out. "God doesn't make women that size. God made her exactly as she is," Jake replied firmly. "And I thank him every day for bringing her into my life." The standoff stretched on, tension crackling in the air like lightning before a storm. Then, from the back of the crowd, came the sound that would change everything. A child's scream, high and terrified, coming from the direction of town. The child's scream cut through the night like a blade, freezing every person in the mob mid-argument. For a heartbeat, nobody moved. Then another scream echoed across the darkness, followed by a woman's terrified voice shouting, "Help! Someone help us!" Sheriff Daniels spun toward town, his hand instinctively reaching for his gun. That came from the Hendersons' place. Mrs. Henderson's face went white as moonlight. "Susie," she whispered, then louder, frantic. "That's my Susie." The mob that had come to drive Temperance away suddenly found themselves facing a real emergency. Men looked at each other uncertainly, torn between their mission of hatred and their duty to help a child in danger. "Go," Temperance said firmly, stepping down from the porch. "All of you, go help that little girl." "We don't need help from you," Dr. Mitchell snapped, but his words lacked conviction as another scream pierced the night. Temperance was already moving, her massive strides eating up ground faster than any of the men could run. Jake grabbed his rifle and followed, the mob streaming behind them in a confused mass of flickering torches and shouting voices. The Henderson house was in chaos when they arrived. The front door hung open, and Mrs. Henderson was on her knees in the yard, sobbing hysterically while her husband tried to calm her down. "What happened?" Sheriff Daniels demanded. "Men," Mr. Henderson gasped, his face streaked with blood from a gash on his forehead. "3 of them, maybe 4. They broke in looking for money, valuables." When Helen screamed, they grabbed Susie and rode off toward Devil's Canyon. Devil's Canyon. Every person there knew what that meant. It was a maze of rocks and caves 20 miles north, perfect for hiding and nearly impossible to search in the dark. If the kidnappers made it there with the little girl, they might never be found. "I'll form a posse," Sheriff Daniels announced. But even as he said it, everyone could hear the doubt in his voice. By the time they organized a search party and rode to the canyon, the trail would be cold and the child could be anywhere. "No time," Temperance said, her voice cutting through the panic like a sword. "They've got maybe an hour head start. If we're going to catch them, we need to go now." "We?" Dr. Mitchell scoffed. "You're not part of any rescue mission." But Temperance was already studying the ground, reading tracks in the moonlight with skills learned from her late father, who'd been a hunter before drink destroyed him. 4 horses, heading north toward the canyon road. One's carrying double weight. That's the one with Susie. She looked up at the assembled crowd. These people who'd come to drive her away now standing helpless while a child's life hung in the balance. "I know those canyons," she said quietly. "My father hunted there when I was young. I know every cave, every hiding place, every way in and out. And I can track in the dark better than any of you." "She's right," Jake said, moving to stand beside his wife. "Temperance knows that country better than anyone." "I don't care what she knows," Mrs. Henderson sobbed. "I just want my baby back." Sheriff Daniels looked torn, his hatred for Temperance warring with his duty to save the child. "Even if you could track them," he said reluctantly, "what then? You're just one woman." Temperance's smile was grim and determined. "Sheriff, I killed a grown man with my bare hands when I was trying not to hurt him. What do you think I can do to men who've stolen a little girl when I'm trying to hurt them?" The words sent a chill through the crowd, but for the first time since meeting her, they weren't afraid of Temperance. They were afraid for the men who'd taken Susie Henderson. "I'll need 2 fast horses," Temperance continued, already moving toward the Henderson stable. "Jake and I will go alone. We can move faster that way, and we won't spook them into hurting the child." "You can't go alone," Sheriff Daniels protested. "It's too dangerous. More dangerous than letting those men disappear into the canyons with a 6-year-old girl." Temperance challenged. The sheriff had no answer for that. 20 minutes later, Temperance and Jake were riding hard toward Devil's Canyon, following a trail that would have been invisible to anyone else. Temperance rode like she'd been born in the saddle, her massive frame somehow perfectly balanced on her horse as they raced through the darkness. They found the kidnappers just before dawn, holed up in a cave exactly where Temperance had predicted. 4 rough-looking men with a terrified little girl tied up in the corner. They never saw Temperance coming until she was already among them, moving through their camp like an avenging angel. The fight was over in minutes. Temperance's size and strength, combined with her desperate fury at anyone who would hurt a child, made her unstoppable. Jake barely had to fire a shot. When they rode back into Cedar Ridge with Susie safe in Temperance's gentle arms, the entire town was waiting. Mrs. Henderson collapsed in tears of relief as Temperance carefully handed over her daughter, and for the first time since arriving in Cedar Ridge, Temperance saw something other than fear and hatred in the townspeople's eyes. She saw gratitude. She saw respect. She saw the beginning of acceptance. "I was wrong," Mrs. Henderson whispered as she clutched her daughter. "I was so wrong about you." 3 years later, when visitors came to Cedar Ridge, they often heard the story of the giant woman and the cowboy who loved her. How she'd gone from being the town's greatest fear to its greatest protector. How their love had changed not just their own lives, but an entire community's understanding of what it meant to be different. And if those visitors were lucky, they might catch a glimpse of Temperance Sullivan working in her garden, surrounded by the children of the town who no longer saw a monster when they looked at her. They saw the woman who'd saved Susie Henderson. They saw the lady who baked cookies for church socials and helped with the harvest and read stories to anyone who asked. They saw someone who'd learned that love wasn't about being perfect. It was about finding someone brave enough to see past your imperfections to the person you really were inside. And that was a lesson worth more than all the gold in Jake's original bride price. Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey of love, acceptance, and the courage to see beyond appearances. If this story touched your heart the way it touched mine, please like this video and subscribe for more amazing true stories that will restore your faith in the power of human kindness. Tomorrow, I'll be sharing the story of a homeless man whose single act of generosity changed the life of a billionaire forever. Trust me, you won't want to miss it.